From Amateur Radio Newsline Report number 2082, these are the Ham Nation headlines for Wednesday, October 4th, 2017. There's justice at last for the killer of David Coed, N6 DAC. It arrived at his sentencing in an Orange County, California courtroom on September 22nd.
You emerged as the face of evil in this community. Those were the words of Superior Court Judge Thomas Gethels as he imposed a 232-year prison sentence on Scott DeCry. It was back in October 2011 when DeCry, heavily armed and wearing a bulletproof vest, walked into a Seal Beach hair salon and shot his ex-wife. He kept firing at everyone else in sight and then made his escape. In the parking lot, he spotted David Coed, N6 DAC, sitting in his truck. N6 DAC was a former star high school athlete who loved off-roading in his Land Rover. Thinking he was an undercover officer, DeCry shot the 64-year-old Ham, making him the 8th fatal victim of his rampage. DeCry soon surrendered, but his case dragged on as evidence mounted showing widespread misuse of jailhouse informants by the district attorney and sheriff's offices. That led the judge to rule out capital punishment, even though DeCry had pleaded guilty. However, the verdict gave him no chance of parole. In closing the case, the judge said that there were no winners in this case, only losers. The only win, he said, is by the rule of law. From Orange County, California, this is Joe Mell, K0 Oscar Victor, for Amateur Radio Newsline.
Hams on the International Space Station want students to look to the sky and then start talking.
So what exactly do you say to an astronaut? Well, if you could have been on the air with space station astronaut Joe Acaba, KE5DAR recently, you might have asked about his concerns for his home in Houston, as well as his family's homeland in Puerto Rico, both impacted by recent hurricanes. Schools, museums, youth groups, and science centers will get the chance to ask these kinds of questions and other kinds of questions next year as the Amateur Radio on the International Space Station program once again solicits for proposals for groups to talk to the orbiting crew members between July 1st and December 31st of next year. The program connects students around the world with the men and women in space, but these radio contacts require planning. The ARIS program looks for participants who can build a well-thought-out lesson plan around the actual contact itself, which occurs over amateur radio. That means students are exposed to radio science, satellite communications, wireless technology, and other STEM topics. Deadline for proposals is November 15th. For proposal guidelines and other information, visit arrl.org/ARISS. As any educator will tell you, there's a lot that can be said in those important and unforgettable 10 minutes. For Amateur Radio Newsline, I'm Neil Rapp, WB9VPG.
Finally this week, one of the many amateurs to step in with communications assistance this hurricane season was Stan Hartz, KK4WCW. Stan joined the vast team of hams connecting Puerto Rico storm victims with worried relatives here in the U.S. Overcome with emotion after completing a successful contact on September 23rd, Stan decided to share his feelings on social media. And now, we've asked him to share that with you. Here's Stan.
For the past 5 years, I've been into amateur radio. People sort of look at me like I'm crazy sometimes and ask me why I just don't use a cell phone. Puerto Rico has recently been devastated by Hurricane Maria, and there's no cellular phone system in operation. The Salvation Army is running what is known as a welfare net, where persons in Puerto Rico can get a brief message from a family member there locally on paper and relay it to an amateur radio operator in Puerto Rico to one on the U.S. mainland. Depending on a variety of conditions, some people hear certain signals better than others. Today, from that net, I took a message for a family with a 910 area code, the same as mine. I called to tell the person that their family and their home was okay. Other than a slight language barrier and the bit of confusion as to how I got the message, the man started to cry with joy. About 15 minutes later, his wife called me back and asked for better details on how I got the message. It seems her husband forgets some of his English when he's crying. Well, by that point, we were all crying. So for those who ask what my hobby is all about, this is it. The iPhone 10 won't reach Puerto Rico right now, but a 1990s vintage amateur radio on a 12-volt battery and a 100-foot wire antenna strung between two trees in my backyard will. This is KK4WCW.
Thank you, Stan, and thanks to every amateur who joined in these efforts everywhere. Stan's words speak for every radio amateur doing this priceless work. Ham radio is all about connections, and in these trying circumstances, those connections also happen to be lifelines. For the rest of this week's Amateur Radio News, please listen to the full Amateur Radio Newsline report online on a repeater near you or on shortwave radio station WTWW at 9930 and 5085 kilohertz. And that's all from the Amateur Radio Newsline, your independent source for amateur radio news for 4 decades and counting at www.arnewsline.org. With Joe Mel, K0OV, Neil Rapp, WB9VPG, Stan Hartz, KK4WCW, Karen Eve Murray, KD2GUT at the news desk in New York, and our news team across the globe. I'm Don Wilbanks, AE5DW. 7-3. We'll see you next time here on Ham Nation.